Senator Chris Murphy, thank you so much for speaking with me today in celebration of the 25th anniversary of our Gun Policy Research Center here at Johns Hopkins. You've been a champion in promoting evidence-based policies to reduce gun violence in America. Can you share a bit about why reducing gun violence is such an important issue for you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for all of the fantastic work that Johns Hopkins does. We rely on it. If you've listened to virtually any speech that I've given on this topic over the past 8 years, you are likely to hear a reference to research that's been done at Johns Hopkins, because you are obviously best of breed when it comes to trying to dissect fact from fiction. And there's a lot of mythology when it comes to the issue of guns. So we're deeply grateful to everything that you've done, and hope that you're going to be around to help us for a long time into the future. Yeah, listen, I mean, I'm embarrassed that I have only dedicated the last 8 years of my life to this issue. I obviously was transformed by the experience in Sandy Hook. I was there that day and have come to get to know those families very, very well. That community will never, ever be the same. But I really hate the fact that I had not worked on this issue prior to the murders of 20 kids in Sandy Hook, because I grew up on the outskirts of Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford, Connecticut is a neighborhood that has endured epidemic levels of gun violence for over a generation. And I care about this issue of gun violence, not just because it now occupies the news a lot more than it did because of the pace of these mass shootings, but because I've learned how we're literally ruining a generation of low-income children of color who live in neighborhoods like the North End of Hartford because of their exposure to gun violence. I always tell people it's not a coincidence that the low-performing schools in this country are very often, or maybe by and large, in the neighborhoods prone to gun violence. It's because when these kids fear for their life every single day, walking to school or going to pick up milk at the corner bodega, it fries their brains. The trauma that these kids go through, fearing for their life, having to live through shootings on a regular basis, it renders them unable to learn. And so while we often talk about this epidemic of gun violence through the prism of deaths, right? 100 people dying a day from gunshot wounds. That just sort of scratches the surface of the real toll of this epidemic. And that's why I care about it, because I have learned over the years that as unacceptable as it is, that there are 100 people dying in this country from gunshot wounds every day, is just as unacceptable that a whole generation of children are having their youth, their education stolen from them because of the trauma that exists in this handful of neighborhoods. That's what drives me to work on this issue.
And you have a book on this topic, The Violence Inside Us, A Brief History of an Ongoing American Tragedy, that explores the history of violence in America. Your book was written before the death of George Floyd and before the sharp increase in gun purchasing that has occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. Have the events of the last year changed your views at all on the strategies that we should be thinking about for reducing gun violence?
Well, I set out to write a book explaining why America has these epidemic rates of violence, and maybe more generally to try to explain to people why as a race, humans are so prone to this kind of violence. And I ended up, unsurprisingly, writing a book about race before the summer of 2020, because there is no way to explain American violence than through a prism of centuries of racial oppression, centuries of violence being used by what I call in the book in-groups, largely over the last 200 years, white Americans, to keep oppressed and subjugated outgroups, by and large African Americans. The form of that violence has changed. It was, initially slavery, then it was lynchings, now it's incarceration and intentional impoverishment, but it's violence nonetheless. So I don't know that that anything over the last year has changed my perception. I think this has always been a discussion rooted in race. But what we have seen, as you mentioned, throughout this COVID epidemic is both record levels of gun sales and some very high elevated levels of gun violence, which just, I think, further proves the point that many of us have been making for years, that when you buy more guns, both in the legal and illegal markets, you have more gun violence. Contrary to conservatives' belief, more guns doesn't lead to less gun crime. It leads almost always to more gun crime. And I think that's what you're seeing in 2020 and 2021, a lot more people buying guns and a lot more gun crime.
So in our center at Johns Hopkins, we study many different policies for reducing gun violence, including things like purchaser licensing, background checks, temporary firearm removal policies like extreme risk protection orders, policies regulating gun dealers, safety training, and the list goes on. In your view, what are the most important policies that Congress and the states should be considering for reducing gun violence?
Well, I think we should just follow the research. I mean, I just think that we should do, what works. And part of the reason that I push the hardest for universal background checks is because the data tells us pretty clearly that that is one of, if not the most effective intervention. But it also happens to be the most politically popular. 90 to 95% of people think everybody should go through a background check before they buy a gun. And your research at Johns Hopkins showed, what happened in Connecticut when we imposed our universal background check system back in the 90s, about a 40% reduction in gun crimes, versus what happened in Missouri when they got rid of their requirement that everybody goes through a background check. They saw a pretty immediate double-digit increase in gun homicides, and guns bought in Missouri all of a sudden started showing up in homicides being used all around that region. So, the data that you've produced tells us that universal background checks is really important. But as politicians, we all have an interest in getting reelected, and when 90% of your constituents support something, that probably is going to be a benefit to your reelection. So that's why I think our focus should be on passing it first, a background checks requirement, and then moving on to some of these other interventions.
So politics has become incredibly divisive in recent years, and gun policy is often viewed as a highly partisan issue. Yet research by our center indicates, and you just alluded to this, that there are many policies for reducing gun violence that both gun owners and non-gun owners support, including many of those policies I just mentioned. Where are the opportunities, or are there opportunities to find common ground on this issue?
I think the first thing we have to do, and I think it's a really important question, maybe the most important question, what we have to do is just completely reject the idea that this is a controversial issue. It is controversial in Washington. It is controversial because the NRA has created a mythology around guns over the past 30 years that has taught people it's a third rail. It is not. It is not. Today, there are very few issues that bring Americans together more than the issue of guns. And I know that sounds totally wacky to say, but it is true. There's nothing that has 90% support in this country. Background checks does. Today, bans on assault weapons enjoys 60 to 70% support. The majority of Republican voters in this country today think that we shouldn't sell assault weapons any longer. This is a unifying issue outside of Washington. And so the key is to making a unifying issue inside of Washington. And the way that we do that is to just build up more power behind the 90%. I'm a big supporter of anti-gun violence groups, from Moms Demand Action to Giffords to Brady. They are organizing 90% of Americans. And in doing so, you will create more of an imperative for politicians to not listen to the groups that are representing 5 or 10% and listen to the groups that are representing 80 to 90% of Americans. So building up the political power of the anti-gun violence groups are really important, but also just rejecting, not sort of feeding into this narrative of the issue being controversial. That's really important as well.
So my last question, this can be a really tough issue to work on. And we've all been living in a particularly difficult period with a pandemic upending really every aspect of our lives right now. Where do you personally find the energy to press ahead with your own tremendous work on gun violence prevention?
I remember when I was in the state legislature, I passed a bill authorizing money for stem cell research, and we were the first state in the nation to do it. And I'll never forget this moment. I was a young, new state legislator. We were walking out to our cars at the end of a long day of debate on that bill, and a senior member of the state Senate said to me, "Man, there aren't many days when we get to make decisions here that affect life and death directly." And he said, "This is one of those days." And then he just got into his car and drove away. This is one of those issues, right, where a small adjustment saves thousands of lives, right? You just tighten up the nation's background check system, and you're going to save a life, 10 lives, 30 lives. And I think in many ways that's the measure of our time in these offices, is whether we've made people's lives better, but whether we have stopped preventable death. And so I just pursue this issue with a passion, because I'm surrounded by all of these survivors and all of these victims and all the folks who have lost family members, and they give me inspiration, but also because I just know that of all of the issues that I work on, success here maybe has the biggest difference, maybe has the biggest impact on my country and my community and my neighborhood, and that certainly keeps me going.
Thank you so much, Senator Murphy, for taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, congratulations on 25 years.